Hey, good morning, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Coffee Chat with Matt. Happy to be here with you this morning. We are here in late April, the 22nd of April, 2023, which is Earth Day. So I thought that it would be great just to talk more about plants. Surprise, surprise, right? I think the single best thing that we can do as stewards of the environment, even if our environment is a in-town city lot or big acreage out in the country, I think the single best thing that we can do to make an impact is to plant plants. So yeah, let's talk plants. All right, let's jump in here with some really good cold hardy stuff. First one I brought up is a heuchera or coral bell right here. This one is called Spellbound. This is, again, what we would call seasonally advanced. So this got a little bit of time in the greenhouse, and so it woke up a little bit quicker than, say, a coral bell that you might have in the ground, which is probably growing already. All of mine at home are producing new growth. They're all up and actively growing, but none of them are, full out flowering like this yet. But this one's called Spellbound. I really like this one for two reasons. One, it's a nice compact plant. It only gets about, even with the flower, about 16-ish inches tall. The other thing I like about this is you get this sort of two-tone look. So the top of the leaf has these kind of silver panes with this kind of dark purpley green veining. So it almost kind of gives you like a stained glass type look. Very cool. The back of the leaf is completely purple, and so when you have leaves at different heights and different angles, it kind of gives you a neat two-tone appearance. And then lastly, the yellow flowers, or kind of it's a little yellow exterior of the flower. The inside of the flower is actually kind of white, but the stems are all purple or burgundy. So you just kind of get this really neat multicolored effect with the flowers there. Heuchera are great plants. They are kind of semi-evergreen, so a lot of times they'll stay green throughout the winter months. They tend to be very hardy. The only thing that I recommend with these is to try to plant these in the spring and summer months so that they have a really good chance to get rooted in. They don't develop a crazy big root system, and so sometimes if you plant them too late in the year, the whole plant will heave out of the ground because it doesn't have enough roots to hold it in. So, I would say before October 1st would be ideal for most coral bells. And yeah, they're great plants. The nice thing about these is they can grow basically in almost full shade, but certainly pretty heavy shade to partial sun. If it is a very hot, dry location, these are not going to love it. But great plant for some color, especially you can kind of see I have a lot of green stuff up here. There's lots of greens, and that burgundy really stands out nicely. I like to use that in the landscape to offset some of the green. So I've got a bunch of different varieties of coral bell at home, and they're all fun plants. I've talked about this one actually a couple of times. Oh, look, we got a weed in the pot too. Let's get rid of that. I've talked about Virginia bluebells a couple times on the program here. But I just wanted to mention it one last time because in another week or two, or well, maybe a little longer than that, we won't even see them anymore. So Virginia bluebells is an ephemeral. It shoots up in the springtime. It flowers with these very cool blue or purpley blue flowers, but the flower buds are this really nice lavender pink type color. So again, you get that two-tone appearance. I have a bunch of this planted in the far back edge of the yard in the shade, kind of a little woodland setting. Absolutely offers a really bright splash of color. It naturalizes really well, so it'll kind of pop up in other places. Not invasive by any means. It is native here. Very, very hardy, cold tolerant, so really a great plant for a nice pop of color. In fact, these would even go really nicely in these or tulips or daffodils, things like that. That would be a really nice thing to do. They only get 12-ish inches tall, and they're best in mostly shade. If you have a spot that is sunny in the spring because the trees don't have leaves, but then gets shaded, that'd be perfectly fine for them. I just wouldn't put them out in the wide open, hot, dry location. The next plant I brought up is another native plant here in northern Illinois. This is called Cardinal flower. And this is my go-to when a customer asks me for something that will attract hummingbirds. Cardinal flower is always my number one. It has these bright red, it's not in bloom right now obviously, but has these bright red kind of star-shaped flowers with a little bit of a throat inside, which is great for the hummingbird to get its little beak and tongue in. Hummingbirds tend to like that. Anything that has, kind of a more tubular shaped flower, those are the kind of flowers that they tend to like. And Cardinal flower fits that bill. It'll get about 24, maybe even 36 inches tall. So you're going to get this nice tuft of foliage at the bottom, and then it's going to develop a flower, spike, or stalk with red flowers up and down it. Full or mostly sun for Cardinal flower. One of the other cool things about it is that it's very water tolerant. So if you have a very hot, dry location, it's going to need extra water there. However, if you have that, spot at the bottom of the downspout where the downspout is always dumping, or you have maybe the back corner of the yard near the utility boxes or something like that where the water tends to just sort of pool, or just every time it rains it tends to be mushy back there, things like that. This would be a really great plant for a location like that. We have a ditch that runs along Town Hall Road, which we're at the corner of Route 64 and Town Hall, and we have this ditch that runs along Town Hall Road, and a lot of the water from the garden center pitches down into that ditch. So even in the middle of the summer, that ditch tends to be a pretty wet location. Well, we've taken that area and turned it into basically a wetland / rain garden. And so we're just in the process. We basically tried to kill off all the invasive plant material that was growing wild in there already. And last year we planted, I don't even know how many hundreds of native plant material plugs. So very small little plants, because we were doing hundreds of them. And we put 2 flats of, so there's got to be at least 76 Cardinal flower out there. We'll see how many of those survive. They're very small plants, but I saw a handful of them coming up already. So they're doing great. I'm sure they'll love it there. And I'm excited to see what that turns out to be. But you can do that in your own yard. You don't have to have a big wet ditch or a wetland or anything like that. Average soils are fine, or wet soils are fine. Now, if you go to the other end of the water tolerance spectrum, you're going to find this plant right here, which is a lavender. This particular one is called Phenomenal. And I planted a couple of these, more than a couple. I probably planted 5 of these 3 years ago. And I have just been absolutely thrilled with how well these have performed in the landscape. Now, I do tend to have a pretty well-drained soil at home. For whatever reason, we have a lot of natural kind of sand and gravel in our soil, so it does tend to be pretty well-drained, which is really great for lavender. If you have a heavy soil, you may consider adding play sand or something like that to the soil. We do have play sand in bags here. Anytime you have really poor drainage, sand is a kind of a good soil amendment. It's not a salty sand. It's not coming from from the ocean or something like that, where it's got a lot of salt buildup in it. So nice and clean, good for use in the landscape or garden or things like that. But lavender here, this particular one, Phenomenal, just gets huge. I mean, each of my plants is probably 30-ish inches across. It gets about 18 inches tall with its flower spikes, which are just starting on this. Again, this came out of the greenhouse, so it's got a little bit of a head start. But lavender is kind of a semi-evergreen, almost sort of borderline shrub. It's kind of an in-betweener. It's not quite fully perennial where it dies completely to the ground. But great plant, purple flowers, fantastic fragrance. edible, or you can use it in cocktails, in cooking, soaps, and all that kind of stuff. So really great for that. Also just wonderful as a just normal landscape plant. So really like that. Full sun, well drained soil. Generally speaking, after I planted them, I probably watered them once every 7 days ish for the first month or so, and I'm not sure that I really have watered them since. So they definitely like it on the dry side. Smell is just absolutely fantastic here. Just even waving my hand across it. I brought up a couple of delphiniums because, well, I just love them. Delphinium in general is one of the few plants that has a truly blue flower to it. True blue colors are very hard to find in nature. There's a lot of purples and pinks and things like that, but blue, for whatever reason, tends to be a pretty rare flower color. But delphinium does it. This particular one is called diamond blue. I was going to say blue diamonds, but it's called diamond blue. And one of the interesting things about diamond blue is that you tend to get very heavy flowering on thinner stems. So you get lots of stems with lots of flowers. The reason I point that out, and I brought one up here, is that some of the other delphinium develop a fairly thick in diameter flower stalk that is actually hollow, and this one actually already partially broke. That's the reason I brought this up here, even though it's still blooming and doing great. But the flower stalk on this one broke because they're hollow. So one of the things, if you're growing delphinium, is that if you can stake them early, little thin bamboo stakes work great, but staking them early on is a good idea, especially if you have a windy location. So they like full sun, which tends to be, out a ways from the house most often, and therefore not protected. So the bamboo will help support it, but that hollow stem breaks pretty easily. Whereas with this type of delphinium here, where it doesn't develop that really thick stalk, you just end up with this really cool ferny textured foliaged plant with tons of little blue flowers on it. These are in the ranunculus family, Ranunculaceae. So we talked about ranunculus a couple weeks ago when I did a talk on early spring cold tolerant annuals. We talked about ranunculus. So same family, very cold hardy, tends to be a pretty early blooming plant, and I really love it for the color. Now, there's also all sorts of great new introductions. Delphinium, plant breeders have been working on delphinium for a while now and have really developed some pretty awesome flowers. This one right here is called Red Lark, and it has almost a salmon colored flower with this just really neat texture. Kind of has this little swooping, I don't even know what this is called. It's technically part of a petal, probably an attractor of some kind, but just really great sort of double flower. When we say double, that typically means it's got 2 layers of petals versus this delphinium here, which just has 1 layer of petals. So it's a double blossom. This is definitely one that develops that flower stalk. Now, delphinium can bloom pretty well spring through summer if you deadhead them or cut off the spent flowers. If you don't cut off the spent flowers, they tend to stop blooming. Delphinium are not a crazy long-lived perennial. They usually only live about 3 to 5 years in the garden or landscape. So it's just kind of something to know. You'll have them for a while, and then after a few years, they may go away. But it's kind of hard to beat the flowers on these. We have some of this variety without this one. Like I said, has the sort of broken flower stalk, and they're already up about this high, not quite in bloom, but I wanted to bring this one just as an example. And I know it's going to be hard to see on here, but you can kind of see where this flower stalk broke. It's actually still alive because it's barely hanging on, but it's producing flower buds and everything, so we'll leave it on for now. And then as soon as it's done, we'll just cut off that stem. But there's more stems coming up. There's another flower stalk here and another flower stalk here. So it's just going to keep on going. So this is Red Lark. It's a new one. Really very cool plant. Delphiniums, you're going to want to check the tag on those because depending upon what variety you get, they could be anywhere from about 24 inches tall to almost 4 feet in some cases. So fairly tall, sort of good, background plants, or even in the middle of a perennial garden because they're not an overly heavy foliaged plant. So you're going to have that flower stalk stick up with other flowers around it. It's going to be fine. One of my favorite early blooming perennial plants are the Columbine. Columbine is a native here in northern Illinois. We have a bunch of native ones at home. They do tend to reseed themselves a bit, so it's just kind of something you should know about Columbine. They're very easy to get rid of if they do reseed themselves. But I love when perennials reseed themselves for the most part because I just get more plants and more flowers out of them. So I brought this one up here. This is called Early Bird Red and Yellow. There's a whole series that we have called Early Bird. As the name suggests, they tend to bloom just a little bit sooner than the others. Mine at home, which I have the just native Canadian Columbine it's called, or Eastern Columbine, or Wild Columbine. I have that at home, and it's up and green and doing well and starting to develop its flower stalks, but is not quite in full bloom like this one, like the early birds. But as the name suggests, early bird red and yellow, you've got this kind of pinkish red exterior with this little yellow center. Really a good early plant for hummingbirds. They're not here yet, as far as I know, the hummingbirds. I haven't heard any reports of them being in northern Illinois yet, which is good because we really don't have a lot of things blooming for them just yet. But if you plant wild columbine, by the time the hummingbirds get here, the columbine should be blooming. So there's all different purples and blues, whites, yellows, reds. So really a great group of plants. Part sun to part shade. I'm not sure that I would put it in dense shade, but also not great for like crazy hot sun. So kind of a good plant that in my garden at home, it's in the back of kind of a pollinator garden. And so it comes up early and blooms. It's in full sun, but it comes up early and blooms. And then there's other stuff on the south side of it that pops up. So by the time the sun gets really intense and it's summertime, the taller plants are giving it some nice shade during the midday. So it does a really nice job in there for me. I've got some meadow anemone nearby, which has little white flowers. It's another native plant that'll bloom relatively early. All right, let's keep moving along. I brought this one up. This is a plant called Gallium or sweet woodruff, and probably one day I should just do a whole talk on ground covers because there's, dozens, if not hundreds, of different varieties of ground covers that we can grow in our Zone 4/Zone 5 area here in northern Illinois. But Gallium is a really good one. Sweet woodruff, as the name suggests, has a really nice sweet fragrance to it. It has this really neat star-shaped foliage, which I really just love the texture. You can kind of see it, it's almost like these little rosettes of foliage where it sort of wraps the stem, which just is a really unique texture. Most plants don't grow in that fashion. And then right at the top of the stem, you get these little white flowers. It is an early bloomer. These really didn't have they didn't really come out of a greenhouse. They were overwintered in an unheated greenhouse, so they're probably just a touch ahead of what yours might look like at home, but not much at all. And they've been outside for a while. In fact, you can see just a tiny, tiny bit, even though they're very cold tolerant, just a tiny bit of frost damage, a couple little tiny black leaves on here. And as I mentioned, those are most likely the newest, earliest leaves that were coming out when we had that frost. There is absolutely nothing wrong with the plant. It will be perfectly fine, but great little spreading ground cover for full shade to part sun. So this is another good one that if you've got taller trees or a mature landscape and you're tired of mulching and tired of looking at mulch, or maybe the sun-loving perennials that you planted 20 years ago when the location was sunny are kind of dying out or maybe no longer producing flowers, things like that, this would be a really nice replacement for those, or just a really nice ground cover to fill some lower space. As far as I know, we still have some planted in the landscape on the east side of our building. Just kind of a nice little blanket over there. I think it's still there, and it always has done a really good job for us there. I brought these up. Hopefully you can see what that is. This is just an asparagus plant. This is Jersey Giant. And the reason I brought it up is that some people are kind of, I don't know, I'll just say intimidated by planting asparagus. I actually think it's relatively easy. We sell these little dried root systems right here. And you dig a trench, you plant them. I've talked about this before. You fill the trench with about 2 inches of soil, wait for some green to pop up, put 2 more inches of soil in, wait for some more green to pop up. You keep doing that until your trench or your mound is filled, and then you'll have asparagus. We've taken the guesswork out of that. We've also shaved off a year of time. These are almost ready to harvest right now. I mean, they technically would be, but I would rather establish a healthy root system, so I wouldn't harvest these even though they're ready to go. But if you don't want to have to worry about digging trenches and laying out roots and planting and doing all that, you can just take home a 1 gallon asparagus, just drop that in the ground, plant it right at the level of the soil in the pot, which is right about there. So you're going to dig a hole about 6 or 8 inches deep and backfill with a little soil and compost, and off you go. You'll have asparagus for like 20 years. It's great. I have a wonderful asparagus patch at home, and it produces every year. In fact, probably starting maybe later this week, we'll be able to start harvesting almost on a daily basis. We can go out there and get a nice big kind of handful of asparagus, and we throw it on the grill and we cook it and do all sorts of stuff. So I love asparagus, and it's a cool perennial vegetable. That's kind of neat that once you get them in and established, you don't really ever have to redo it or replant them. So that's pretty great. Yes, speaking of plants that you might have forever, I thought I'd bring up this beauty. So this is actually a peony called fern leaf. It is a very old-fashioned variety, very rare and hard to come by, and sought after by collectors, but just a neat plant. I first found this plant at a property that we were working on in Wayne probably 20 years ago. The only reason I knew what it was is by the flower, which, this has yet to fully open. It's one of the earliest peonies to bloom, but it has this beautiful red flower right here, or red flower bud. But I could tell it was a peony just by the buds and flowers, but I had never seen it before. And sad to say, this was, before the times of the internet. I mean, maybe, certainly early in the internet's infancy, so we weren't using it regularly. There certainly weren't plant ID apps or anything like that, so I had to start looking in the books to find a peony that had this fine textured foliage, and then it jumped out, right? Fern leaf peony, which of course makes sense with that very ferny textured foliage. But a really nice old-fashioned plant, lives basically forever, as peonies typically do. Peonies are a very long-lived plant. And this is a shorter peony that does not require staking. It only gets about 18 to 24 inches tall. The ferny texture, the red flowers, very, very cool plant. So this would be a really nice addition to your garden, both just for the foliage texture as well as these beautiful flowers, which typically are opening right before Mother's Day. So definitely an early blooming perennial peony compared to most old-fashioned peonies. I've actually talked about this plant a couple of times, but I brought it up because they're just really, really looking fantastic. This is a Deutzia called Yuki Snowflake. Now, Deutzia is a shrub that's been around a long time. We used to grow Deutzia back in the 80s and 90s, and then for whatever reason they sort of fell out of favor, and we just really weren't growing or selling them anymore. And then, I don't know, maybe 6 to 8 years ago, something like that, Proven Winners came out with this Yuki series. There's two in the series, Yuki Snowflake and Yuki Cherry Blossom. This is Yuki Snowflake. As you can see, the flowers are white, and on Cherry Blossom they are pink and white, so it's kind of a little two-tone flower. But it's a very cold-tolerant shrub. I have some at home on the west side of my house. They get all afternoon sun, shade in the morning, afternoon sun. They have done very, very well. Those are Yuki Snowflake, and then out in a kind of a perimeter bed out in the yard, I have some Yuki Cherry Blossom that maybe get a little midday shade from an old linden tree, but morning sun and late afternoon sun, and they're doing equally as well. Really heavy blooming shrubs. I think that's what I like about them the most. The other thing that I like is that the flowers are very dainty, so you still get to see some of the foliage. I like the contrast of the white flowers or the pink flowers against the green foliage. And it almost ends up with like a nice graceful, slightly arching habit, kind of a nice moundy or arching shrub. Really good for the foreground. Mine is, the ones that, the Yuki Snowflake that I have are sort of near a dwarf ginkgo. So the ginkgo is the specimen, and then there's a sidewalk, and right along the sidewalk in front of, or between the ginkgo and the sidewalk, I have the Yuki Deutzia right there. And they've done really well. In terms of trimming, they are an early blooming plant, so they will bloom on both new and old wood, but I do find that trimming them right after they flower tends to produce better flowers the following year than, say, pruning late in the season or very early in the season before they bloom. So I like to give mine a haircut right after they're done blooming, and that way they really bloom nicely for me the next year. About 18, maybe 24 inches tall, 24 to 30 inches wide. Full sun to part shade for those. Got just a couple more. I brought up one of my favorite native grasses. It's Earth Day. I've talked about a handful of native plants. We talked about the Columbine and the Cardinal flower and the Virginia Bluebells. One of my other favorite natives is Prairie dropseed. It's a grass, and it is one of the earliest to come up ornamental grasses or native grasses. So one of the things I like about it is how early it comes up. So when we look at other native grasses, little blue stem, big blue stem, switchgrass, all of those tend to come up when the soil gets much warmer. And so at this time of year, there's really nothing there. But prairie dropseed comes up very early. So they're like in the prairie, in some of the areas around here where they've done some controlled burns recently, you can see these really nice tufts of green all over the prairie, and a lot of that is prairie dropseed. One of the other things that's cool about it is that particularly in the fall, it has nice fall color. So it sort of goes kind of a yellowy orange to sometimes sort of copper, maybe even a hint of burgundy to it. The neat thing about it is at that time of year when it's in bloom, the flowers have a really nice fragrance, or I would say an interesting fragrance, sort of a popcorny mixed with cilantro or something. It's kind of weird, but very cool plant, very, very hardy, and a favorite of the birds. So the seeds that are produced after the flowers actually are a grain seed. So they're really good and nutritious for birds. You actually can harvest them yourself, and you would need a ton of it. But the Native Americans used it as a flower, so you can take the seeds off of it. It's edible for people. It's edible for the birds. But very cool plant. Prairie dropseed gets about 24 to 36 inches tall and has also kind of a nice moundy habit. There's also a really neat dwarf version of it called Tara, T-A-R-A, and that's also a really nice one. It does everything the same. It's about maybe not half the size, but somewhere between half and 2/3 the size of the species. So maybe it's going to be more like 12 to 18 inches instead of 24 to 36, something like that. But really great plants and very, very cold hardy. So I really like prairie dropseed a lot. It has a great texture because it has this very kind of fountainy, flowy texture to it or habit to it. So it's really nice if you've got, you know, stiff, upright shrubs and things like that, to have something that can really soften the bed or soften the plant material around it. This is a really good choice for that. We have this nice little planting area in the front of the building. We've got some raised beds, and there's this kind of odd-shaped, it's almost like trapezoidal shaped planting bed that's raised up. And I don't even remember what used to be in there, but a few years ago I tore everything out and we planted a bunch of prairie dropseed, and so we just kind of created this nice little feature bed with only prairie dropseed in it. It looks great. It does it every year. Looks awesome. So I really like that one a lot. And last but not least, I brought up a really cool salvia. This is called Back to the Fuchsia. So it not only is a cool plant, but it has a really cool name. This is part of the Proven Winners collection, and is a good hummingbird plant, good bumblebee plant, really good rebloomer. So what I always tell people with salvia is that salvia, if you don't deadhead it, tends to sometimes just kind of sort of peter out. So what I like to do with salvia, after you get this first beautiful flush of flowers, you take the whole plant. I mean, this is still in full bloom. I'm not doing this right now, but I take the whole plant almost like you're putting your hair in a ponytail, and you just cut it off. And it does it that way. It will rebloom. It does really well. This is a full sun plant. It has a nice fragrance, kind of a slightly minty fragrance to it. But again, great for hummingbirds, great for the bumblebees and honeybees and stuff, and really heavy blooming variety. It, again, sort of gives you this two-tone. You've got the pinky purple on the outside with the darker buds up the center. So I really like this one. It's a great border plant. And salvia are tough as nails, and they bloom for a long time. So I really like this a lot. Thanks again for watching. I hope that you get to enjoy this Earth Day. And again, there's nothing better than putting some plants in the ground to help celebrate Earth Day and do our part in conserving and stewarding the environment. So thanks for watching.